Welcome to the With Pride and Grit podcast, a show dedicated to helping you navigate a season of transition in your life. I'm your host, Jen Pasquale, and as a 16-year military spouse, I know firsthand how challenging life's transitions can be. I also know it's an opportunity for growth, discovery, and new beginnings. In this season of With Pride and Grit, we're sharing stories of military spouses who are or have successfully transitioned to civilian life. We'll also hear from experts who can offer valuable insights about transition resources available to support a spouse's journey. Whether you're just starting the transition process or already well on your way, this podcast is for you. We hope to provide you with the knowledge and inspiration to make the most of this new chapter in your life. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get started. Welcome back to With Pride and Grit. Today's episode with Traci Conner was a really great conversation about the importance of communication within a marriage, going through transition, and the importance of checking in with our kids and understanding where they are and what kind of support they may need from us as the family transitions from service. I hope you'll stick around. Hi, Traci. Thank you for being here with us today. I'm very excited to hear a little bit more about your transition story.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So for those who don't know you, I would love it if you would give us kind of a snapshot at who you are and what your military life journey has looked like before we launch into all things transition.
All right. Well, I'm Traci Conner. I am an occupational therapy assistant and a certified health and wellness coach. We just celebrated 21 years of marriage, like last week. And my husband hit the retirement rolls right before that. So about a week and a half ago from now. I've been a military spouse for right at 21 years when he retired. And we have gone all over the country. We have never gone overseas. He did Korea before we were married while we were engaged. But then after that, the Army just never saw fit to send us overseas. But we've been all over the country. His career was interesting in that the first part of it was really with the combat brigades and multiple deployments, high op tempo and whatnot. And then as he became a lieutenant colonel, it transitioned and he moved to the industrial base. So we spent the last several years more with the industrial base. So he had his 05 command was all civilians. He was the only guy in uniform. Right. So we've seen a wide spectrum of the military. His 06 command was DLA. So that was Joint and Defense Logistics Agency, if you don't know what that is.
Thank you.
I know we all love our acronyms, but every service, everybody's different. If you're not part of that world, you don't know that one.
Yeah.
So he had a joint force under him, a small, and then still lots of civilians. So that's we've just done this wide spectrum of the military and seen all sides of it. He did his major school. He did ACSC with the Air Force. So we got to go and see that side of, another, instead of staying all Army, right? But then he did the Army War College. So we were part of that. So that's kind of our, multiple deployments. He did Iraq, Afghanistan multiple times. We're old enough that his first deployment when we were dating was Kosovo. If I really want to date myself there. For some who might not like why don't remember Kosovo.
Right.
Yes.
I understand that. I think what something you said was really interesting, which is, and it kind of unique about your story. I'm curious to hear how it influences things for you all, is that by sort of shifting career-wise in the way that he did, he sort of has had his kind of feet in both places, right? A lot of civilian influence and interaction, and then still, wearing a uniform. So as we get into talking about your transition story, I'd love to kind of have a sense for you too. That means you've probably been at bases where, you don't necessarily have the typical military life experience and military spouse experience from a community perspective. So I'd love to understand, as you look at the transition process, how do you think that shift has influenced kind of how you approach transition and what that's going to look like for you all?
So I would say my husband's been transitioning for 10 years. Because once he kind of got involved with civilians, he started in a way a lot of guys don't think about, but being on LinkedIn and really looking at his resume. I mean, he started a resume a long time ago and has just continually tweaked it but in a way of constantly getting feedback for the civilian side, right? Like knowing that was coming. But also, so we did end up living at Carlisle Barracks, which, if you don't know Carlisle Barracks, it's a sleepy little place in central Pennsylvania. There's actually a ton of military in central Pennsylvania that a lot of people don't recognize or know about. It's a lot of the logistics and the industrial base. So we have still had the military community around us, even if we just didn't quite fit in with it all the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, completely.
We did for 3 years live on Carlisle Barracks. We moved away for 2, and when we came back, we bought a house, and last 3, we've lived in the community because we moved during COVID and housing options. So that's a whole nother whole nother story, right? Like, but yeah, so I would say we've been looking at transition for a really, really long time.
Yeah.
Even though on the flip side of it, I really thought my husband would be one of those guys who would stay in until the army told him he had
Mhm.
to get out, right? But there was always that side. He was always working and thinking that angle. So we've had, I think that, and part of that, like working with civilians so much and being in the worlds he's been in, got him thinking through that faster and sooner, so that it's always been part of the conversation for a long time.
And is that when you say part of the conversation, is that between the 2 of you? Like, have you been talking kind of post-army life for a long time?
In some respects, we've had the conversations of what he would life would look like for him afterwards. And
And
then you say, how did that influence me? I
mhm.
actually went back to school. So when I became an occupational therapy assistant, that's when he was in his '05 command that I went back to school, because he was in this world that didn't need me,
Mhm.
so to speak, right? Like, I was able to go ahead and think through like what I wanted to be when I grew up, and start figuring out some of those things
Sure.
that so many of us say, and I've heard you say it, like, oh, after 20, then I get to do what I want. When
Mhm.
he retires, I'll get to do what I want. I did get to go ahead and start processing that. I wouldn't say I figured it out, because I keep changing and getting distracted and thinking, oh, that would be fun or that would be nice. So I think this time when we do our final move and settle down, there'll be that reality of, I don't have the excuse anymore of saying, well, in 2 years we'll move. I don't know what that's going to look like for me. But yeah, so I kind of moved into a different direction too, because we were not with units that required me to be heavily involved.
Which sort of creates the space for you to go through, in not that it's a perfect world, but, in terms of how we talk about at Pride and Grit, the process of transition, you had the ability to kind of start your journey early and be able to be a little bit ahead of his, even though you guys have been talking about it for a long time. I would love for you to kind of paint me a little bit of a picture for how, what was the conversation where you guys say, okay, this is the date, this is the timeline, like we're finally like ready to go and do the next thing. What was that process like for you as a couple?
So in the end, for me, I said to him, it's your decision. Like, I don't, this is not going to be something where you say you're doing this and you feel this, and any resentment comes back on me.
Mhm.
That was a concern I had, of
Sure.
any resentment coming back on me later, of saying, you made me get out. So I
Mhm.
made sure that was not part of the conversation, that there was not that being given. And I told him, I said, ultimately it is your decision. And we talked through, and he would talk with me through factors, our kids. Our oldest was starting high school, so thinking through what that would look like for the next several years if he kept going, what that would look like for her. She'd already done 3 middle schools.
Mhm.
And then our younger one, who really battled through developmental delays and was finally coming into some stability for herself. Like, what would that do to then put her through multiple middle school, high schools, and whatnot? So that became a big factor in it. So we did have those discussions of, what the next few years would look like, whichever path he chose. But I still left it as, ultimately the decision is yours. And some people would not agree with that. They would say that that's got to be a couple decision. I get that.
Mhm.
Where we were in that moment, I needed it to fully be his decision. I needed to know that was his choice.
No, I think that's a really interesting thing to bring up that I haven't had a chance to talk, through with anyone yet, but I've heard that before as well. I've heard it from other friends who were very deliberate about sort of staying out of the final timeline while still informed, which is what I hear you saying. Like you,
Mhm.
as a couple, you were both very informed about what mattered to each other, what mattered to the family, what are the factors that need to be considered, but then ultimately leaving it to him to say, I'm ready to continue my career or I'm ready to move to a different career. Like having that decision really largely be his own and being comfortable with that. And I think you're right. Like it's different for everybody. And for some couples, that's absolutely the way they may go about it and be okay with that and feel like that's right for them. And then for others, they may feel differently. I think it's figuring out what's best for you. But that open communication is the thing that I hear you talking about that I think is so important no matter what, right? No matter how that decision is made. It sounds like you guys have always kind of operated in that space.
Yeah, and I mean, communication is really hard, and it's something he and I have had so he made the decision a year and a half ago now, 2 years ago. So it was something where, yes, we did talk about it, but it was still always very surface. So I think, my message to a lot of people now is make sure you're really communicating, not like surface level communicating, but make sure you're really having the conversations that maybe you've avoided for a long time
Mm,
because it's going to come up. Like, it's all gonna come up. So be communicating and keep communicating. I would definitely make the comment that Trent and I would not still be here together if we didn't keep finding ways to communicate. Because we fall apart sometimes and we
mhm,
realize those are the times we're not talking, we're avoiding each other, or we're avoiding saying some hard things. And then once we say them and get them out, it brings us back closer together. So through all of it, you have to communicate your feelings,
mhm,
no matter how hard, good, bad, anything in between. Like it's definitely a time, especially our generation after 20 years of war, where maybe we did stuff some stuff down and we did just have to survive through some times on both sides, right?
mhm.
That you need to have the conversations.
No, I think that's such a great point too, in terms of just the idea that we've our kind of generation, if you will, of military spouse, where we have been through a lot of those deployments. And you and I were probably part of the same deployment, briefings that said, don't tell them what's happening at home and don't
Right.
communicate what's going on because it makes it harder for them to focus on the mission. And that was the narrative was you need to own it in silence and not kind of out in the open. And so there's these habits that if we haven't kind of undone some of those habits during these years where we maybe haven't had as many deployments, then we're going to get to transition and we may not have the right tools. We may not have the right habits to be
Yeah.
able to really be open and honest and not make up stories about, what someone else might be thinking or feeling or how they might be impacted by what's bothering us. And so it sounds like for you guys, transition definitely included communication, which I think is something we hear and see a lot. And as you mentioned, in marriages in particular, as you go through that transition and you go through those identity challenges, having some sure footing within the relationship can be really, really important during what feels like a wobbly time otherwise.
Yeah. Because I mean, I think even talking to friends, the strongest of marriages, it's still a wobbly, stressful time.
Yeah.
So it's not easy, no matter how ready you think you are for it or how any of it, like it's still hard.
What I guess looking at that, what has been, I guess, the most surprising in terms of what was easy about the process, and then the most surprising about what was hard about the process for you or you as a couple? But I'd love to focus on you a little bit.
Well, easy, I would say, would be for him, and is that, my husband's definitely the type when he makes a decision, he goes all in on it. So I haven't had to hound him about doing medical appointments or, which I hear a lot of fellow
Mhm.
spouses are being like, you got to push him to get all that done. Nope. My husband, he does. If the army told him to do it, he'll go do it. And so I have that working to my advantage as far as that process of it. But for me, the most surprising thing by and far were my girl's response when he made the
Oh.
decision. So I really thought that they would be ecstatic, right? Like they would be ready. Our last deployment was in 2019 and it was hard on
Mhm.
them. It was really hard on them with the ages they were at the time. And they were, always dreading that that could be a possibility again. So I really thought they would be thrilled. The idea of, we'd move to one location and they wouldn't really have to worry about moving again till college or anything. Instead, what happened was they had their own identity crisis.
Mm.
My youngest, I said, "What is wrong? Like, what's going on?" And she said, "Well, if I'm not a military brat, then what am I? Who am I?" And I was like, "You're 12 years old." Like, she's 13 now, but this was last year. And I was just like, "What do you mean?"
Yeah.
But then I came to realize, like, they were both really struggling with not being military kids anymore and not being in that genre, I guess. So we had to have lots of conversations on that they'll always be that. They'll always be the daughters of a soldier. They'll always be, now he's
Mhm.
just a retiree guy, but
Mhm.
they're still a veteran's child. Like, they still get to wear that identity
Mhm.
and will always be that. But that's not all they are. And they had taken that on more than I realized they had. Again,
Interesting.
because Trent had not been in traditional units, so we were not, you know, we weren't doing the things that some of our peers were, that their kids were experiencing. So I just kind of didn't think my girls had assumed that identity in the same way. So realizing that they had and that it was a struggle for them to process him retiring was definitely the most surprising thing to me.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting, and to your point, not necessarily a given just because you're, like, in an area where you're super ingrained and you're very active, or in your case, very different climate, very different situation, and yet it's really about the individual and kind of how they've have absorbed that over the years. And we, in some ways as a community, we I think at least try to do a lot to kind of wrap our arms around military kids and be
Yeah,
encouraging and supportive of them and their hardships, and recognize that they're going through their own hardships. But we forget that the more that is an identity, right, and the more that is something that they do take on, the more it comes with that challenge at the end of service of not knowing who they are and feeling that kind of disconnect. So that I appreciate you sharing that, because I imagine there's other folks listening who may have thought, oh, my kids are going to be fine. They're not going to have any issues. And so I think what I
yeah,
love about these interviews is the ability to just kind of plant a few seeds so that if that, grows something down the road, you won't be completely surprised by it. And you'll realize that actually that's pretty normal and not untypical of this experience, that, kids could struggle with identity just like, their parents could potentially during the same process.
right.
Yeah.
My kids even asked that where we moved to be a military community.
Interesting.
So they did. They said, because we're from Metro Atlanta and we were talking about going back home. And even though there is military around there, it's really spread out. Like, it's not a tight
Yeah.
knit community, right? And they were really stressed about that. And they asked if we would consider moving to an area that had a strong military community. So we're not staying here where we are because all of our family is south and far away, and we would like to get closer to them. So we actually are going to the Redstone Arsenal area in the Huntsville, Alabama area,
Mhm.
which has a large military community, and the schools that are heavily invested in the military kids, because even though they'll be retirees kids, we're still doing our final PCS. Like, they're moving
Mhm.
in as military kids in my mind.
Right.
And in the school's mind, they'll look at them that way. So we're hoping that will provide them kind of the support and environment that they were looking for, because they have been in schools that were not very military friend, not to say not military, not very military knowledgeable on what the
Sure.
kids go through. And so they just found it really hard.
There is something about going into a school system that just wraps their arms around military kids in that very informed way that I can imagine will just make them feel better and be more encouraged in that environment, and to be surrounded by all these other military kids. So the decision to go to to Huntsville. So tell me about kind of, was that, I mean, yes, so that your kids said, okay, I would love a military, community. So that
Yep.
becomes
That was
on
a
the check
black check.
boxes, right? So what was it that really drove you into that community? Because I know for so many people, the decision of where to live and what to prioritize is one that just kind of they struggle with, right? Because it feels like this huge decision. And I think we almost build it up too much as forever
Yeah.
home and forever this and forever that. And it's like, no, it's just, it's for now. I always say forever for now because I
Well,
feel like
so
it's a
we're
lot of
even looking
pressure.
at it that way. This is our
Yeah.
5-year plan
Right.
because in 5 years, our youngest will have graduated high school and started college and have gotten a year of college under her belt or whatever she decides to do for a year after school. So I keep saying like this is the 5-year plan. Because I'm really curious to see if we could ever, like, settle and stay somewhere longer than that. I'm thinking around 3 years, I'm gonna be like, "Shouldn't we move?" Like, but yeah, so it just when we laid out our priorities, being closer to family, our parents, my husband's an only child, so we really wanted to get
Mhm.
closer to his parents. I really wanted to go to the beach, like, that's my dream. If you know me, my happy place is at the water. Should have married a sailor, but I didn't. But there were all these things, the kids asking for that military community, all these things. So when you list them and lay them out, it became, okay, where checks the most boxes for us?
Mhm.
And so Huntsville gets us close to our family in Georgia. Is it like drive over in an hour? No, but it's still close enough to go and come back in a day if we wanted to.
Mhm.
And definitely to get there quick if there was an emergency or something, someone needed us. It's 5 hours from the beach. So I've measured that to the Gulf Coast. So that checks my happy block. And so it just the pieces fit and made sense. We've actually never lived there. But how abnormal is that, right? Like we're gonna say, yeah, we're gonna go spend the next 5 years at a place we've never lived. And
Mhm.
that's just part of it, right? But so I don't know. We went down there and we looked around and we bought a house
Mm.
and that's what we're gonna do. But I think it just came down to, we laid out what we wanted to accomplish in the next 5 years, what we were looking for, and just started kind of playing the pieces around the southeast of where checked the most boxes. And to be fair, my husband's a logistician. If, he needs to change jobs or whatever,
Yeah.
Huntsville's a great place for him to, go find another job. He has his plans and has already started working post army. But if for whatever reason that doesn't work out, he can just easily find a job we think
Right.
around that area.
At
So,
year 6, you'll have lots of options, I'm sure.
right.
Yeah. No. And it's funny, I know not a ton, but I feel like around every corner, I seem to find someone who's moving to Huntsville, so I feel like maybe we're missing out.
So that's been happening up here too, where we are. Like I was sitting in a committee meeting the other morning and someone was like, "Oh yeah, we're going to Huntsville too." And I was like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah. No,
So
it's
yeah,
apparently
it's
it's
kind
the
of
place
funny.
to be.
Another hidden little place, right? That
I
nobody
know.
thinks of.
So I don't think you mentioned this, but I would love to know a little bit about kind of your journey through transition. So how has like you're letting him kind of take the reins on the timeline, but how has the process been for you thinking forward to what does this look like for your business? What does this look like for developing a new community? Tell us a little bit about what that experience has been like so far for you.
So it's been kind of disjointed for me. I feel it's been kind of hard. So as he's gone through his process and all his medical, that's brought up a lot of stuff to confront. I talked a little bit about my kids and the identity crisis they were feeling and a lot of stuff that's come up with them. So I feel like I've really been taking care of trying to get all of them through it.
Mhm.
So when I stop and think about myself, I've been feeling pretty lost. If
No.
I'm being honest, like just having that moment of, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what this is meaning for me yet. Like I started heavily focusing on my kids when I realized they were struggling more than I expected. So I kind of did put myself aside for a little bit on that. But, and trying to keep the communication going with my husband, it's been hard. It's been hard to focus on myself
Mhm.
and to think through and trying to wrap up everything here, like knowing, like now we're in that phase where my girls are falling apart because now they got to say goodbye to friends again. So,
Right.
my 16-year-old just started crying on me the other day. So I'm dealing with that. Right.
Mhm.
So it's hard for me to kind of think through for myself right now. I have some plans, but I realized lately I'm just starting to say, okay, I'll deal with that in July. I'll think about that
Sure.
in July.
Yeah.
Like once we get on the other side. I'll think about that for myself.
Well, and I think isn't that what we've done for for 20 years, right? Like if you know, the way that at least I'll speak for myself and you can sort of say if this is the case for you as well, but with each PCS it was okay, prioritize, what does the family need and
Mhm.
what do the kids need to be settled and who are the, finding all the kids doctors, finding all the sports, picking the schools, making sure the house is what we need, all of those pieces, all that sort of emotional energy that we're spending isn't typically tied to just, what do I want to do? What do I think that is next for
Right.
me? That comes later after everyone is sort of settled. So it's interesting to hear that, even though you guys kind of had a lot of lead time at the end of the day, sometimes things kind of pop up that need your attention and your focus. And so that habit of just, okay, I'll just wait. I'll wait and, I'll deal with me later. I
Yeah,
think
and
is
it's
probably
something that's ingrained in us.
I
Yeah.
think it is a little bit ingrained in us, and so it's just an interesting perspective because maybe that's okay, right? Maybe that's just how it needs to be in order to get there, because then you're there and you'll have all the time in the world to figure
Right.
out what that would look like versus trying to fit it in right now where it just doesn't feel like there's space for it. So I
Yeah.
can really appreciate how hard that must be to kind of shoulder all the just a lot of there's a lot of emotion in this process. And you mentioned, the medical appointments and bringing up things. And I think I've heard
Mhm.
that before too, that sometimes things kind of come out of the woodwork that need to be addressed and are a little bit, kind of critical that we weren't expecting, that we need to talk through or we need to help support our service member through or our kids through. So
Yeah.
I think you're in good company actually in
Right, because it's just
in that
another PCS in the end, right?
right. Right.
So right now it's our final PCS, so to speak, but it is another PCS right now. That's the mode
Yeah.
I'm in. That's the mind
Yep.
frame I'm in, is that's just what's gonna get done. So it's interesting, and and yeah, the stuff that comes up with the service member, it just becomes when you start looking back and you're like, "Oh, that makes sense," or I get that now," or, and then there's things where our service members just kinda kept going and kept going,
Mhm.
kept going
Mhm.
and kept going and never addressed things, and now all of a sudden they're having to address these medical issues that my husband at once said to me, he's like, "It just seemed to have gotten so bad so fast." And I was like,
Mm.
"No, it didn't. You've been
Mhm.
complaining about this stuff for years. You're just
Right.
now acknowledging it."
Sure.
So it seems bad because you're paying attention to it now, whereas before you've complained about it, but then you've ignored it.
Right. Because there just wasn't time and space to make that a priority.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that's pretty common too, unfortunately.
Right.
Talk me through a little bit of from a service perspective and just like a resources. I would love to understand what you as the spouse through this process have found most beneficial or most helpful in terms of, information or resources that you've leaned on to just kind of help you understand how this process is going to go, what you need to be anticipating, anything particular you'd recommend to folks listening.
For the spouse, I
Mhm.
gotta say they're in short supply. From what I have seen, a lot of it's been other spouses who have already gone through the process. I mean,
Mm,
we do happen to live in a place that has a high military retiree population. And so within on posts, like I have connections with a lot of those spouses since we've been around here on and off for a while. And so being able to ask them, like, did y'all deal with this? Did what did you find? I think in the future there might be some resources that we use as a family that will help more. But
mm,
we haven't tapped in sooner. With Wounded Warrior Project being one of them, some things along there, some services through the VA that I think will come out for the family that will be helpful. But there hasn't been, I mean, I did the American Corporate Partners mentorship,
mhm,
and that was helpful to have someone to talk through like my business ideas and my career kind of side of it and what I wanted to do. So that's a year-long program. If you don't know about that, that can be really helpful. And my husband, for his side of it in transition, also got a mentor through them and found it very useful and they're still in touch to talk through
mm.
all the options, right? Of what it can look like and what your ideas are. So that was helpful. But yeah, for the spouse, it's kind of hard. I did the 1 day of class that they always encourage the spouse to go to for the transition program, just to hear about the medical and the VA and all that sort of stuff. Again, I'm blessed in that I have a husband that really takes care and pays attention to all that
Right.
himself. So he can come home and explain it all to me and talk it through, when you get into SGLI and all this stuff, all
Mhm.
these options and whatnot, like, he's one that really gets all the probabilities and then can lay them out for me and we can talk about them. So I don't have to always go to the briefings to understand all of that. But yeah, there's not a lot of resources. I've tapped in with you a lot to listen to the things, right? Like,
Yeah,
because
no.
you're talking transition, you're bringing transition into your conversations to help these senior spouses. But yeah, unfortunately, there's just not a lot that I have found out there. But
Well,
maybe that's because my husband's so good at finding answers for me. I don't have to go search for them.
I was thinking that perhaps those 21 years of marriage sort of served you all well in that he knows kind of, oh, Tracy's going to want to know about that. Oh, Tracy's going to want to know about that. Like I imagine he's got some notes in his, in his book going through those classes, knowing what questions
Right.
we're going to have, having that, that experience with you to know, oh, yeah, this is something I definitely need to highlight for her. So that definitely sounds like it helps the process that you don't necessarily feel like you have to run down all those answers because you've got someone who's going to bring all those to you. But
Yeah.
I think you're right. There aren't a ton of resources. I think what you did reference though is a really important one, which is leaning on those who've been there and leaning on those who've done it so that we can get a perspective on, is this typical? Is it not? How did you handle it? How did you help your kids through their identity
Right.
challenges? I think leaning back on our community can be one of the best ways to just learn a different perspective and a different approach to a situation. So I love that you're in a place where you can do that. I mean, not everybody's going to have that, and I think
Right.
it's a
Yeah.
huge benefit to you right now to be able to tap into that community.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely it's always helpful, right? When you have other spouses to talk to. We're our best resources because we're
Yes,
the only ones that truly understand.
right. I would love to just kind of close us out with any kind of final words, but in particular, if there's sort of one thing you could offer to someone who is about to approach the transition season, they've got a date, they're ready to start their pluses and minuses list. What piece of advice do you wish you had had when you guys really started to go down this road with more a definite timeline?
That's a tough one. I think the biggest thing is just to communicate and keep communicating, keep writing things out, like putting it on paper
Mm,
and writing it out so you both see it or putting it up just where you have those conversations. I don't did y'all ever do PCC where you had to do like the big paper roll out
the
papers
charter.
and then like
Yeah.
yeah. I actually think that would be really helpful at this time to literally do something like that because when you don't communicate and don't talk and then you're both having these separate ideas of where next goes
Mm,
that just that then it causes all these problems because you
mhm.
have this like many of us saying when they get out I get to do what I want, so you've had all these ideas for 20 something years, right? A lot of us of what
Right.
we're going to do in the afterlife. Uh, so if you're not sharing those and communicating those, they have these great ideas too. And what service members aren't going to just stop serving and stop being who they are. And I struggled with that, like being able to say, you've taken the uniform off, like expecting him to totally change. He's not going to
Mhm.
totally change.
Mm, no.
That's just part of who they are. And so you have to keep communicating. You have to, if necessarily, like put it in writing,
Mhm.
do the things that work for your marriage that will help just keep those conversations going so that you don't end up all of a sudden you're planning completely different lives, really,
Mhm.
right? Like,
I love that concept of almost like a vision board where folks do that at the beginning of the year and kind of set their intention for the year. But what I hear you talking about is more of kind of this transition vision that you're doing together and even as the whole family to sort of say, okay, this is how we're going to approach this transition. This is how we're going to integrate into the new community. Here's some of the things we're going to do to make sure that we build our own new community where we're going. You all have that advantage of being in a heavier military community than some, But I
Right.
think still it's not quite the same. You're not going to the same functions as all the active duty folks that may be there,
Right.
but certainly some similarity. So I love that idea. I like things kind of written down in visual anyway, but I love the idea of kind of creating a transition vision for the whole family and actually talking through all those things so that
Yeah.
everyone knows their role and everyone knows how they're going to contribute to helping the family kind of further those goals. So I don't know if you meant to pitch that to us, but I think it's a great idea.
No, I think that's a great idea too. That's exactly what I meant.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great thing to end on because I think that's an actionable thing anyone can do no matter where they are in their transition process. Even if
Right.
you're 3 years
Yeah.
out, you can still think about, well, what do we want to do over the next 3 years until transition? And then you could do it again once you get a little closer. So I think that's a repeatable effort that could be really valuable for folks within their families. So thank you
Yeah,
for the
and even
idea.
a few years before you're ready to approach transition, there's things you could be doing to be laying groundwork and to
Mhm,
be, like I said, my husband was prepping for years just by getting contacts and being active
mhm.
on LinkedIn and like knowing his industry outside of the army. Those sorts of things that helped him know all the paths he could take afterwards. So you can break it into those chunks, like you're saying, if you're a few years prior and do that. And there's still things you can be working on.
Yeah, no, it's good advice. Well, I appreciate you spending some time with us and sharing a little bit about your story.
Thank
And I have
you.
no doubt someone will connect with something in there. And particularly the part about your kids, I really appreciate you sharing that because I think one, we haven't really talked about it yet, but two, I think that's going to help someone else who's in a season like that and is kind of wondering what this is and what this means. And so hopefully
Yeah.
you've helped a little bit in that way.
Well,
So
good.
thank you.
Yes. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you for being here. That's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the With Pride and Grit podcast. We're so grateful to our guests for sharing their stories and expertise with us, and we're grateful to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. And we always appreciate you sharing us with a friend or leaving a kind review. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can find us on social media under @Pride and Grit or on our website, prideandgrit.com. Until next time, please remember you're not alone on this journey, and it is our privilege to walk alongside you.